Welcome, everybody. We are live in our ITDUG Facebook group, as well as have some live participants in our Zoom meeting, which you can still register for. This topic today will be about client asset documentation. I'm just going to read to you a prepared statement. Are you getting confused on what information you need to collect or don't regarding your client's technology assets? Maybe you're not even collecting this data yet. Take a tour with us as we explore methods and examples of client asset documentation. We'll talk a little bit about the various systems involved, including ITDUG, ConnectWise, Autotask, Confluence, and possibly many, many more. I also love interactive. You may interrupt at any time. Veronica will be monitoring messaging, or feel free to just pipe in by unmuting yourself. You may also try Facebook comments on the live feed. Just keep in mind there is a slight delay, so it might take us a minute or two to see that response and maybe another minute or two to get it worked in. For those of you who might be tuning in from elsewhere, this is hosted and put on by the IT Documentations Users Group on Facebook. You can see the various URLs there. The Facebook page is live posting, helping, peer-to-peer help. And on our website at ITDUG-webinar is all the past webinars, and where this one will be posted later this week. ITDUG was founded by Tracy Harden, who could not be here today, but she owns Next Century Technologies, an MSP in Kentucky, founded in 2001. She founded this group May in 2018 to help her figure out how to use IT Glue. In August of that year, we opened it up to all platforms, and she invited me to help her with the group. We then quickly hit 1,000 members, 2,000 members. Note the date says February 2021. We'll be over 3,000 because we're at 29 something right now. So keep inviting people, because the more people that are joined, the more people who can ask you good questions or answer your good questions. I'm Alan. It's always fun to talk about myself. I can go on for ages, but the basic points are I've been doing IT a very long time. I have also owned an MSP like many of you guys. We were able to sell it for a profit. I worked with 2 other MSPs in leadership after that, which we had great success again. I'm also an ES implementer, and I founded Eureka Process, where we are working day in and day out with IT business owners to help them with business processes, profits, operations, and frankly, it's 80% documentation. So that's where a lot of these experiences come from. So first, a poll. What do you think of when we say IT documentation? And I'll put that on the screen in a moment. But the question again is, what do you think of when we say IT documentation? You can text your input to the number on your screen, 205-883-8760. I'm trying to be all accessible here, so I'll say it one more time, 205-883-8760. Or all of IT folks probably have already quickly put this in there of swiftpolling.com, enter code 14795. That's swiftpolling.com, 14795. And we're going to take a quick look at the live poll just to see what people think of when they see this. So you're going to see some of these numbers change as people weigh in. I did pre-populate a few of these based on asking a similar question earlier this week in the ITDUG Facebook forum. So I see the word SOP and procedures is quite popular. I'm also seeing the word password in there a few times. Credentials, those are related. Assets, code comments. Very good. How to fix things, network diagrams. So I think the moral of the story is we think of a lot of different things when we say IT documentation. Perhaps that's why there's so many members in ITDUG, because we're all thinking of different things. I know I've seen people come in here for very unique asks that I don't typically think of because I'm in the IT services space, and maybe they are coders or in corporate departments. So we have to get a little more specific then, don't we? I have changed this number 4 at least 3 times this week. And it's been anywhere from 3 to 12 when I'm picking this. So I've tried to categorize these better and get more consistent, the 4 types of documentation. Would love your feedback on how you would categorize these differently. 1, internal processes. This is how to open the office, how to put in tickets is an internal process. How to submit PTA requests. That's a fun one. You might also have a client-facing variation of that, but my favorite is how to submit tickets. That would be a client-facing internal process. I think a lot of us thought of technical processes in the previous slide as well. So you have the technical processes, your teams, your text flow, and how to solve issues. You might also have some for all your clients, like this is how you reset your password. Or maybe even a client-specific technical process, like this is how you set up Outlook on your phone with your settings in it. So that would be a client-facing specific technical process. Even your work notes and your time entries and your PSA is a type of documentation. It's your work history documentation. There's a lot of clues there when you're troubleshooting problems based on that. And then what we're here to talk about today is client asset documentation. This is the inventory of things, both those real, such as hardware, and those a little less tangible, such as software, network diagrams, etc. I do include passwords as a type of client asset documentation, even though they could perhaps have their own category. So step one in documenting anything is to know thyself. Know what you know, therefore know what you don't know. So we have to document our documentation. I have 4 SOPs I recommend for this. The first is the process. This is far better than when I first created it in 2004. Back then it was the procedure. So I've saved you 2 syllables, you're welcome. The process is basically, what do we write based on the 4 types of documentation we went through before? How do we write it, and exactly where do we store it? Maybe you use a documentation system like SharePoint or IT Glue, Confluence, there's a bunch. But no matter what system you use, if you have a clear directions for everybody and how we're going to store things, it becomes that much more structured for you and makes it easier to use. Naming standards. Everything has to have a name so we can quickly find it. When I think naming standards at this level, I'm really thinking equipment, because if I'm going to look up that firewall, I want a naming standard so I can type that naming standard in and find that customer's firewall at that site every time without having to sift through a bunch of folders. Same for passwords. Passwords typically have some sort of name field. How do I know I want to find the Active Directory domain admin on that user? Well, if it's called the same thing for each place, I can always know where to find it. So we should come to an agreement as a culture, as a company, on what that standard is. Those 3 SOPs are actually going to be the topic of next month's webinar, because this month we're going to talk about a document that we happen to have called D05, D for documentation, 5th document we wrote, on asset documentation, where we store everything we know in our company about the assets we document. So what are client assets? Let's give some examples here. Site summary, new user PC setup, applications, remote access, domain, email, virtualization, LAN, subnets, VLANs, NAS, security standards, printers, IP addresses, shares, wireless, and so much more. I'm sure you guys can think of a bunch more. And the last topic, the last pay to play that we'd be remiss not to cover before we document anything is necessary and sufficient. Every piece of data that we decide to record or not to record must pass the test, necessary and sufficient. I'll give you some better, more specific examples you can use to understand this. This is a very important concept. If I was a professor, I would say, write this one down. Will this data ever be referenced again? Let's make sure we don't get in the habit of document everything just because it's a really hard culture to enforce. It feels like busy work. So is it really necessary to write this down? Are we ever going to reference it again? When will someone reference this? And another way I like to ask that question is, what are they working on when they do reference it? Maybe it's a silly example, but let's say that this piece of documentation you wanted to document, whenever they use it, they're going to be inside of a live and working firewall. Well, if they're inside a live and working firewall, they already have a good bit of information in what they're looking at. So how much documentation do they need if it's already there because it's live and working? Maybe, again, silly example, but think about the things that already exist where they're at to help you inform what is actually necessary for where they're at. Is this documentation stored somewhere else already? And if so, maybe we can just link to it instead of recreating the wheel. We definitely don't want double entry. Nobody wants to work more than they have to. The easier we make this to do, the easier it'll get done. Here's a fun one. What should they already know? There is a pendulum that normally swings when we're consulting clients from no documentation to document everything, and then people feel like robots. We've got to leave room for our people to do what they're good at. Maybe that's troubleshooting, maybe that's resolving a specific technical matter. Another absurd example is, you don't have to describe to them to right-click on stuff. They should already know these things as your hired, highly compensated technicians. They just need to know roughly where to go. So leave the room to be them. I want to back up one, actually. I also have a propensity not to include screenshots, as I believe that our technicians should roughly know where things are located at when giving instructions. And it also saves me from having to redo the screenshots with minor updates to software. There's always exceptions, reasons they need a confirmation, specialized software, etc. But I do minimize screenshots. Is this documentation more easily referenced somewhere else? Maybe there's an example where Google is actually more up-to-date than your documentation could ever be, depending on the situation and sources, of course. So again, just one more way to challenge the question, is it necessary? Okay, so based on where they're at when they access this information, what questions are they likely to need answered? I love firewalls as an example, but in my documentation, I hope I have a backup config somewhere else. I don't need every single setting in the firewall. Typically, what I need is the basics of the firewall to get it set up, such as the WAN IP address, local IP address, and who the heck's doing DHCP. And another fun one is is it always? I kind of always say that in the attitude of, but did you die? If you're creating some sort of documentation structure, I have a lot of clients using IT Glue, and if you're using SharePoint, don't worry about creating fields or questions or prompts for things that don't always need to be answered. One minor example is in the olden days, you would ask for, hey, what is the Windows license key, the 5x5 numbers? And you could actually put some structure around that, some data reference checking, data validation. But these days, the way things have licensed have gotten so complex. I have intentionally given up that structure. Now I have a text box that says, how is this thing licensed, with instructions on the types of input to get it. That way, if it's a 5x5 code, or if it's the QuickBooks, it's an application code and registration code, 2 different size numbers, or do you have to log in with a user and password to authenticate? Too many options to structure it, so I give them free rein. So don't build your documentation for client assets around exceptions, only the rule. So let's dive in. I'm going to give you my favorite first example of a client asset. And I'll start with the story. And my team is on the call. Brooke said she might jump in on some of these things as she gets passionate about this stuff, as I do sometimes. Adam's excited about this stuff as well. So we'll see what happens if we have any good feedback here. I was a service manager, and we had this pretty good sized firm join the company at the time. They had become our largest MRR account. And I swear we were about to get fired because we could not set up a new user with a new PC the way she wanted it right the first time. We just couldn't get it right. And she was frustrated. So I was like, okay, look, let's go in and write down generally what you need. Let's agree ahead of time what you need, and we're going to deliver that to you, and you're going to tell us any exceptions. So after that meeting, we actually built 3 templates that I labeled new PC user setup finance, doctors, nurses. And then she submitted a ticket and says, hey, I want to use, this is for a doctor. And I know we agreed on a set of applications, but I want you to remove this one application. It's all she had to write. We were able to deliver the first time. So this became an important piece. The reason I like this one first is because a new PC or user setup connects to a lot of other things, so you can get a feel for how this connects to other client assets, and we can do linking. Obviously, there's a name. Write your rules down in your document, the D05 client asset documentation. However, this can frequently follow either a naming standard, if you have that, or for the new PC user setup case, it's really just more of a generic name for the template. Maybe this is client new user template, or maybe it's client user template finance, sales, admin, whatever the case is. I don't recommend you have too many. Everybody should have one, and a few will have 2 or 3 probably. All right, what applications do we feel are required in almost every case? So if you forget to tell me, assume these applications are going to be installed. Likewise, I like to have a secondary list of optional applications. These applications might be worth asking about because some of them do get it, but I wouldn't assume that without being told. Maybe this even prompts me as the technician or the order taker to ask, hey, did you need Office 365 for this one? Depending on who you are and how strict you are about 100% MSP, you might have the question, do their setups get our RMM agent? Nice, easy checkbox, perhaps. What printers do they need access to? What data do they need access to? What wireless networks do they need access to, if any? Security groups, you're beginning to get a field. Distribution groups, what remote access profile might they have if you're not unified across? Maybe they have some very special things with email instructions. I've had several that have said, everybody in this template needs to be added to these 4 distribution groups, and I want their email forwarded to the boss, storing forward, whatever this be. And are we supposed to automatically assume these types of users need this set up on their phone? Do they take work home with them afterwards? Your list can change. You have to ask, is this necessary? And is this sufficient for your case? And what I like about using this one as a starter, I use the word tag. That's how ITDUG does it. But the concept is, okay, you have applications. Well, you probably also have applications that are a client asset. So you can link to existing data about that. And this can just be a list. So all the ones that say tag, this can link to existing detailed documentation on those pieces. And maybe your group policies are set up so tight that things like printers, data, wireless, security, distribution groups, maybe those things take care of themselves. And if that's the case, it's not necessary. Pull it out of here. And the smaller list can be sufficient for everything you need to create new PC user setups. I'm going to show you how I document this, and it's super crazy simple. I literally write, in my case, I use Word and SMB, or you could put this in your documentation system as well. I write the name of the asset at the top. I create a bulleted list of all the fields. In parentheses, I'm just writing what type of field I want it to be if I have structured data. And then in a sub-bullet, I answer questions. In ITDUG, this could be a hint field. In Autotask and ConnectWise configurations, maybe this is a default field to help you understand what you're going to replace. But anytime somebody comes to me with a question about what should I write here, or what about this special case, I write the answers in this document so that when I'm training the next new guy, those questions are already answered in this document. For the most part, new guys are going to read this, and gals. I don't expect a whole lot of my existing staff to reread these once they've been introduced to it. Another powerful concept behind having this document pre-written, especially if you're in the middle of transitioning to this, is everything that is in your client asset documentation document is stuff we have decided on. We have decided this is what's necessary and sufficient to fill out. Anything not on this list, we have not decided yet. I know in some popular platforms, there's lots of templates that come. People fill in the templates because they're there. And maybe you don't want to stop that, and that's okay. But you can tell them, if it's in this D05 client asset documentation document, then it has been decided and it better be there.
One thing that I've started doing with some of the MSPs that I'm working with is we gather this data now when we do a client onboard. We have a document that's sort of a template that we generated that has these various things on it, and we start asking these questions out of the gate. Because to me, a new user setup or a new PC setup is one of the ways that you can really shine as an MSP, because it's an opportunity. Somebody gets a shiny brand new box. And it works out of the gate. They log in and everything that they need is there. Or a new person. This is a new employee for a particular company. And what better way to really show who you are as an IT firm than to set up everything accurately. The person sits down on their first day, they log in, they're able to work, everything is there, there's no hiccups. It really, makes the thing, transitioning to a job is already stressful. So the last thing we want to do is have our IT firm be a hindrance to that. So this is a really good one, I think, to refine and ensure that there are like no gaps, which is why we started doing it at several places in the onboarding process, to let them know that we want to make this a #1 priority, because we want your users to be able to work when they get a new machine or you hire new people. So it's so important to us that we are now gathering this data during a client onboarding.
I mean, even that one example I gave, Brooke, and you were with me during that example. It was a client changer. We're talking about complete attitude shift, even in other areas of service, just because we listened to a need and we solved it permanently going forward.
And for that particular client, it was a very large client. So they had, they were getting new computers all the time and hiring new people. And it just, not only did it streamline it for them, but it also streamlined it for us. Another thing that we did for that particular client was the PC setup. Alan basically gave her that same sort of choice in computers. Computer, A is like, the top elite C-level computer, B or C. And don't get me wrong, we didn't, you can't always sell the same computer every single time, but these are the minimum specs that you need to have. It makes it easier for the client versus having to every single time look at all the specs on a quote or improve it, or she just says, hey, this is a doctor PC, and we go order the doctor PC. So it streamlined it for that client to make things easier for them, because I don't want to make it difficult for them to ask for a new person to get hired, and I definitely don't want to make it difficult for them to buy something from me. So just giving them some choices and saying, hey, do you want computer A, B, or C? And then you just check the box and keep going. It made it easier for a lot of people.
Very good. Thank you. I'll also take a moment. Our next slides is actually, we're going to dive into another flexible asset and then talk about how to roll this out into your organization before we do Q&A. But if anybody has any questions at this point, I just want to check with Veronica for a second. Do we have chats or questions anywhere?
Nope, we're all good. We can continue.
All right. So as I mentioned, the new user PC setup connects to everything. And I feel like probably the next most populous thing that we do is listing all of their applications. So let me just give us some examples of some things that us and our clients have come up with to name applications. Yes, a name. Perhaps you need to track who the vendor is, especially what your support options are. Maybe this is simple as a text field, or maybe it links to a company in your PSA or your documentation system. Application credentials. Again, maybe you have a separate password management system. So a link to that, so whoever's working on the application can go straight to the credentials and get those served. Where does the application live? Of course, application server these days could be the cloud or Azure or some other places. So you have to be a little more creative, even though it could be a tag to an existing configuration. How do we install this software? Do we have to go online somewhere? Is it in a file share somewhere? How do we do it? And Brooke, you had an example you said regarding an installer location faux pas recently.
A client that I'm consulting with had a little mess up. We had a client that had, it was cloud-based, but they had purchased, and we were migrating a server. So we needed to migrate some of the applications. Part of the documentation that I always preach is that it's living and breathing. Once you get it down, that's not the end of the road. Every time something changes, something updates, it's on the tech, it's on that person to go make sure that the documentation reflects that. And the installer location had changed where we had stored that. So I had a kid that was working on this project, and I just needed him to install some applications, move them from point A to point B. Okay, fine. He used the wrong installer because what was listed in this client's documentation, which happened to be ITDUG, said these are where the installers are at. So those are the ones that he used. It then installed these applications on the wrong drive letter. And this particular application required a specific drive letter to make it work. This was a project, we got it done, everything okay, great. 3 months later, they don't see any data because the data is in the wrong place. We didn't point it to the right direction because we used the wrong installer. So therefore, now I've got to go back and eat some of the time and money on that project because we did not install it in the right place.
So this might have been a case that somebody updated the application and didn't look at the existing notes.
The person that changed where the installers were at, basically the .exe files of, hey, this is where that changed, and we did not update the documentation.
All right, lessons
Living
learned.
in someone's head, and that bit us in the you-know-what.
Neck? Bit us in the neck?
It bit us somewhere in the pocketbook because we had to write off. We had to write off some things, which is never a good thing.
Very good. I mentioned licensing notes previously, that when it comes to licensing, I tend to make it a little more free form and a little bit of trust in my text to know what we need to properly license the software. I love the fact that I let PowerPoint pick the icons for this. It's all the word notes. Hey, musical notes. That's exactly what he's talking about. Perhaps you need to know where this application is installed because you're either counting licenses or it's on a specialized machine. Perhaps not. If it's not necessary for your applications, then don't use it. And expiration date. If you're in a structured system such as your PSA, ITDUG, or Passportal, expiration date's actually a special field. And what I recommend in those is that the advice is don't fill it in unless it matters. Meaning if some action has to happen because of an expiration date, let's fill it in. And almost all the tools that I've seen that have the special field, you can create workflows to trigger on, hey, 30 days before expiration, do X. So usually I have that in my D05 asset documentation, and it says when and when not to fill that expiration date because of those workflows and automations.
That's incredibly helpful for sales, and if you're doing quarterly business check-ins, things like that, so that you can have those items in there. Especially if you're trying to help them get a budget prepared for the year, because a lot of times they don't remember. So you need to, that will be helpful to make sure that you know what those licensing fees are, so you can help them prepare their budget for the year.
I'll keep repeating it: necessary and sufficient. If it's not necessary, let's not create noise because it happens to have an expiration.
And also think about this from the tech side, but a lot of these things, like I said, the expiration date, that's going to touch sales and account management. So everything that you're putting here can have far-reaching tentacles that can go help lots of different people in the company. So, keep that in mind that, when you're documenting these things, other people might be able to use that documentation to help them do their job better. So it's not just tech stuff.
As it should, especially if you have a culture of documentation. So creating your own asset or client asset documentation document. To get this culture of documentation, it doesn't happen by accident. And it definitely doesn't happen by yelling or dictating. And some of you might be nodding your heads going, yeah, I know that now. So it doesn't matter where you are, how much documentation you have. At some point, you've got to stop and start documenting your documentation. So if you already are using several client assets and you have some templates together and how it works, but you never decided on exactly how it should work, you never got the whole team involved, well, take a moment, grab one of those and put them into a document that says, okay, this is decided. Are we still clear on this? Is everything necessary and sufficient? And what I like to do is grab a small committee together. Maybe it's a short time committee of a couple of representative folks. If you have a decent size, maybe you grab a tier 1, those who need the documentation, and a tier 3, those who know the documentation. get them together and discuss every field, every client asset. Is it necessary and sufficient for us to both do our jobs? And by having that discussion, they are invested and involved in the process. They're going to hold their peers accountable because, hey, I helped create this. This is what we decided. This is why we decided it. And the ones we've gotten to and decided on are in our asset documentation list. So go check that out and help me out with it. And most importantly, it must be frequently referenced. And I don't mean, hey guys, go read the documentation. Or every morning, go read this document, go read that document. What I mean is we have to use it. We have to have, again, that culture of following the process, reading the documentation. And the way that I do that is anytime, the example Brooke gave, something didn't happen, we tie it back to our documentation in our corrective action. Maybe it's coaching, maybe it's a reminder, whatever it is. We don't say, hey, this is the way you do it. We say, hey, this is the way we wrote down what we're doing. Do you agree that this is correct, or do we need to change it? All right, let's follow this way. Anytime you, I hate to use this word, but let's say you have to discipline an employee, there should only be two reasons to discipline an employee: failure to follow core values and a failure to follow process. And the only way you can say they're not doing those things is by to reference which one of those things is not doing and which one. And that's a great coaching moment, because then people begin to see you answer every question with, all right, here's the process, or here's the client asset you didn't document. Here's where you had to reference it to get your job right. You didn't do that, and now you see the results. If you do that every time consistently, you're going to create that culture of frequently referencing the documentation. It can't be superficial. It has to be a part of the process. It has to be how you get work done.
In a particular documentation platform, ITDUG, there's a score that goes with each type of documentation that you have. If you create a document, you get X amount of points. You update a document, etc. I've done things before where I give little small monetary gift cards. I've sent cookies before, things like that. Whoever ends up in first place, we had a contest we ran for a month. And every single week, whoever was in first place got a gift card or got some, sent them some cookies or sweet treats or whatever, to just sort of really encourage on a positive note, hey, let's get out there and get this stuff done. And, make sure every single time you're working a ticket that you're, looking at an SOP that might be associated with it. Make sure you're checking that client's documentation, whatever assets might be out there. If you're installing some software, creating a new user, just to really encourage it on a positive note rather than just constantly trying to hit people in the head with a hammer.
Another fun game, it's less competitive but still fun, is the Easter egg hunt. You could choose to tell them it exists or not, but you plant an Easter egg in one of the client assets that is supposed to be referenced frequently, like, hey, contact so-and-so, tell them you saw this Easter egg, and you win a free gift.
Get a prize.
Put that out there. When somebody claims it, remove the Easter egg, put it somewhere else until that's part of your culture. That can be just a fun game, especially if you don't announce it the first few times. Just do it. See how long it takes for somebody to reference it. It's a lot of fun. All right, so we have this concept of, okay, we got to document all this stuff. We got to test necessary and sufficient. How the heck are we going to get started? How the heck are we going to get all this data entered? There's so much to catch up on, to fix, to update, to start. So as I hinted at before, I would form a committee, not the whole company, not the leadership team. Pick a guy or two. If you're a 5-person team, fine. Just have 2 people represent the populace to get decisions made faster because they're deciding necessary and sufficient. Pick one type of client asset. Make all the decisions on what data you need, necessary and sufficient. And then have either one person, have either each person of the committee do it, or have one person go record one asset. Let's say you picked firewalls, you decided everything you think is necessary and sufficient. So great. Now go record client ABC's firewall, just one. They're going to go through the work. They're going to come back and go, whew, that was way too much information. Do we really need this? Or actually we have this information. They're going to have feedback, and that committee should take that feedback and improve the process. And then we're going to expand our vaccine trials. We're going to go expand our asset trials, right? Have everybody on the service team, anybody who would ever have a reason to document something, try one of these. Maybe you have a lot and they can pick one, or maybe you have to assign you do client B, you do client C. Have them do one with the purpose of giving you feedback and help teach them necessary and sufficient. Take that feedback and improve it again. At this point, I like to call it done, but then the last question remains, all right, what about all the other assets we have of this type? We have to get the rest documented now that it's good. There are two options. One I prefer, one I do not prefer. The first is create a project, a ticket, however you do it, and invest the time to catch up. I do not like this method. I don't like documenting stuff that I might never get to because the client never calls or whatever the case is. So why document everything? I prefer to do it as you go. I have seen a great exception or two. I had a client that says, look, I know what you said, Alan, but I need to get all the internet circuits documented because that's the number one call we get at 3 a.m. And we were scrambling to get it and we never know who's next. So they created a project. They got all of those done first. It did make on-call go that much easier. And then everything else, when they touched it, they fixed it. That was the rule. Once everybody on the team had a chance to have say-so, they've had a chance to test it, use it, read the client asset documentation document. They were invested. They knew it was there. If you see it, you fix it. All right, now we turn this over to you guys. We can answer any questions you have. If for some reason we don't have enough questions to fill remaining time, I have one more bonus asset at the end of the presentation after our outro slides, just as a quick share. Do we have any questions or anybody who wants to share how they do things? It's a totally open forum. I kind of want to do the old, who was that? Man on the Moon guy, Andy somebody came out and Saturday Night Live and just stared at the camera for a minute. All nervous looking. All right. Brooke, Adam, would you like to share any stories?
Sure. I was having flashbacks with that new user PC setup. We had a client that was a nonprofit and they had users coming in and out all the time. They probably had about 120 users and we would do on average like 5 new users a week sometimes. Like it was pretty crazy. There would have temps coming in and going out and it was just kind of chaotic. So at some point we did kind of say, what do you need on every single PC? Let's get a document together. And we started a version of it, version 1. And I think when I left, we're on like version 9.153 or something like that. Like it had been changed so many times, but it was really accurate to what their current setup was, what everything that they needed for those specific users. And we could go back and reference it. So it helped us save time on those setups. It helped us with the client relationships. We could go and talk to them and say what was done well and not done well, and we can revise our documentation. It helped keep our hours for those setups low because we were doing so many of them. So we didn't want those hours to get out of control pretty quickly, which would make our agreement not profitable just in new user PC setups. So.
Based on my experiences with the MSPs that I consult with now, there is a direct correlation in my experience with efficiency and resolution time on tickets with clients that use heavy documentation, encourage that practice. They have a culture of documentation versus the clients that I have that do not. Also, I'm a big believer that if you can pull something in via some sort of in ConnectWise type, subtype an item, and you can link documentation SOPs for that, it helps to reduce the amount of time that it's going to take to resolve a ticket. I'm also big on it because it helps new people. When you onboard a new employee, if you have that documentation there so that they're not just trying to figure out how all of this works, And you can help sort of give them a push in the right direction. It's great for new employees to be able to drive that as well. And then I also do it a lot in new employee onboardings. I dedicate a good chunk of time on a ticket, on a new employee ticket, to go over the documentation and run through all of these things and how we do them. You know, if there's a naming standard, you know, how to find it, which processes to start with, how to go through all of those things, how to reference them. All of that I think is extremely important when you're onboarding new employees, because documentation is one of the things that I get asked about a lot when we're doing some of the V-screening stuff that we do. They ask, do you guys use documentation? Because everybody knows how hard it is to start somewhere new. And if you don't come into a company that has that, it makes it really, really hard to be successful quickly. It can take a long time, and it makes for a tough uphill battle for a new employee if you don't have that.
Let me expand that one topic you mentioned. I know that we're intimately familiar with it, but maybe our audience is not. A concept that she was referring to is there a way to get the right technical documentation and perhaps the right client asset documentation in front of your technicians the moment it's needed? In our case, we've done some automations in a couple of different PSAs where as soon as maybe the configuration item in your PSA has a link to the documentation, or maybe it is the documentation, which can be great as well. Or if you're doing a technical process, which is outside of this scope, maybe that technical process, because the ticket is coded with a certain issue or sub-issue type or subtype or however your PSA does it, we can automatically add the right link in your documentation system to what they need to follow now. And it's right there in the ticket. Once you can click it and they're there. So anything you can do to prevent searching versus just giving them explicit directions is great.
I had a relevant example like that today, but it wasn't just for new staff. It was for their overnight supplemental staff. So they get an alert in the middle of the night. What do? What would your staff do? So we're working on documentation specifically for them because they won't have anybody to ask in the middle of the night. They need to rely on that documentation. It needs to be good.
Awesome. And Adam, I love it when you say stuff like that, and I have no idea who you're talking about. It's like, yes, the team's just doing work, and I can give presentations. This is great.
I will tell you some more feedback about naming standards, naming conventions. How you're going to name these documents is also really important. Otherwise, you're just going to end up going through folder structures, which is not the most ideal way to make this happen. So having a standard way to name the documents and then teaching that to new people and to old people as well is a constant refresher so that you can easily search for what you need, because there's nothing worse than having, you know, a metric ton full of documentation and I can't find it. I'm searching. I don't know what it's called. I don't know the name of it. If your documentation platform doesn't pull metadata, it can be extremely difficult to find the right documents or the right client asset to use if I don't know what it's called and we don't have a standard naming process.
Yeah, we're gonna share a lot more of that next month. So for those who might be catching this webinar beforehand, come with your questions and maybe the way you're doing things, or we're going to share the way that we're doing things, because we want to create a proper structure on where we store things and come to the agreement and talk about solving some of those problems that Brooke just mentioned. So we have hit our next topic. We figured out what it is. Documenting your documentation. We saw an opportunity to fill out the rest of this presentation with this information. So we'll be glad to share that with you next month. Feel free to participate. We do have additional resources, and I will still take questions even after this as we have a few more minutes left. Our website, eurekaprocess.com, and our brand new website, the eurekacommunity.com. That is our membership-based community. We have separated it to its own domain just to give us more room for menu items. It hasn't really been upgraded besides content at this time. We just got them separated last week. You're welcome to contact me directly. Information's on the screen. And if you're watching this elsewhere or from our website at category/ITDUG, this is how you can join the Facebook conversation, fb.com/groups/ITDUG. For those still tuned in, I have just one more bonus asset for you. This is a copy and paste from our client asset document. Virtualization. I have seen a fair amount of difference on how our clients will document this, this is certainly one example. Some will want to know where the virtualized server is stored at. Some people have gotten a little iffy on even recording the host anymore because many people have very fluid virtualization that can bounce from host to host. So it's a host group perhaps. For those who don't demand everybody be on one single virtualization platform, they might have a couple of choices so that people know if they're looking for a Hyper-V host or VMware host, for example. Exactly who that host is, which virtual machines might exist, and how the heck do we manage this thing? What's that domain to log into or application to launch to manage it? So that's just one example. Your client asset documentations can be anywhere from 10-ish to 20, 30 items. If you get much deeper in that, maybe you're documenting too much because we got to be able to find what we need when we need it and not waste our time documenting stuff that we will never reference again. It's always a fine balancing act. That's what we have for now. This full document is available on our community site, theeurekacommunity.com. Our free trial is going away, but currently it's still active. So I do encourage you, if you're watching this live, if you want to pop into the eurekacommunity.com, register for an account, go grab this document. I will not be offended if you want to cancel afterwards. I'll shed a small tear, but I won't be offended. That's certainly your prerogative to try it out if we don't have other value in there for you. And the biggest value I see in the eurekacommunity.com is actually our monthly community conference call where us four try to hop on and answer all one-on-one questions about anything you see in the site or elsewhere. Most people who attend that find that the biggest value of their community. So with that being said, we're going to practice the method of signing off. I know we're going live on Facebook and we're recording, so I think I'm just going to stop the screen share and end the meeting. Is that correct, Veronica? All right, that's correct. She nods. All right, bye guys. Thanks for attending and hope to see you soon.